All right, as it just said, we are recording, and we're going to get started. Let me see here. There we go. All right. Our topic this evening is protecting your vet business through effective employment practices. And I want to thank everybody for attending. We really appreciate you being here. I'm Holly Corcoran from Corcoran Business Advisory Services. I had a traditional practice for 30 years and decided towards the end that I really liked the advising side of it. So I decided to branch out and just work with veterinary practices with business advising and advanced tax planning. And I'm really enjoying it. So this webinar series that we're having is open to hopefully educate our veterinarians out there because business topics can be outside of the norm that you run into. Um, so I'll be talking for a little bit. I'll be talking about standard operating procedures and key performance indicators as a beginning, and then Warren Cook is my guest from Demystify HR, and he will be taking over after, have his own set of slides, and he'll be talking about the nuts and bolts of how to make sure you're protecting yourself, risk avoidance, and so forth. And I'm going to be looking more at the measuring side. So we're going to go probably about 15, 20 minutes each, and then, or I think Warren's going to take a little bit more time, but we're going to allow about 10 minutes at the end for question and answers. There is a Q&A section on the Zoom, so if you come across a question as we're talking about a topic, please feel free to drop it in, and we will be monitoring that and perhaps asking questions as we go along, or else we'll just take the last 10 minutes or so and answer questions then. So thank you again very much for coming, and I'm going to bring up my slides. Okay. So what I want to talk about first is using metrics and procedures to strengthen your employment practices and support your team. Um, it's great if you have a really good HR system and structure and policy and handbook and have those all wonderful items in place, but they tend not to work if you don't use them. If you formulate it and you put it on a shelf or put it in a computer folder, then it's not being used. And the key performance indicators and standard operating procedures, KPIs and SOPs, help to translate the policy into performance. And what are those items? Key performance indicators are really the numerical association of what your outcome is. And it's based upon what you're measuring, why you're measuring, and when you're measuring something, that's what you're managing. The standard operating procedures are kind of like what they sound. You're setting up steps on how to do any type of procedure. And for tonight, we're just going to be talking really more on the employment side. And there's a variety of things you could be setting up. I'm not going to get into specific items because really it comes down to the practice owner, how they want to work with their employees, the structure that they want to apply so that everybody's on the same page. So again, it's created with the owner's intent. It is your planning upfront. I know it's a lot of work to put those pieces into place, but in the long run, it really saves a lot because it means less touch on the owner, especially if you are a sole practitioner where you're training the employees and they're coming and asking questions. These standard operating procedures really give the employees a reference that they can go to as opposed to continually having to ask questions, and gives them guidance and also keeps things consistent. So for key performance indicators, I'd like to talk about using your um, practice management software to its fullest. There is a ton of information in there, and we can use it for how is the practice running? There's plenty of information to look at there, but we also can look at it on the employment side. And some of these items might look like, well, this is more efficiency related, between the appointment capacity, are there missed charges, average transaction value, such as your revenue by doctor, revenue by invoice, or by patient. Your client retention numbers are, many of the practice softwares now can actually track when the patient is, gone beyond the, standard preventative cares. Are they due for their vaccines and they haven't, been done this spring or fall, or what time of the year it is for a small animal, or whatever it is. And as those patients start to drop off the roll, you can take advantage of keeping an eye on that as to why it's happening. But you can also use surveys with your clients that are leaving or current clients, find out what's going on. And this may have to do with operational and employee issues. This is one way to get a highlight as to what's going on. Um, Also, you can tie the metrics that you're going to be using to a specific role, such as your customer service, your vet techs, your doctors, like the doctor per revenue. If you have technicians that have billable charges, you could monitor that as well. And it gives you the opportunity to be able to say, okay, this is where we're at. Is there a way that we can go to a better number if possible? Or what are we seeing in those numbers and how we are operating as a practice and how that affects our employees? So the SOPs are standard operating procedures, which are basically, to-do lists on how to take care of a task. Um, these are the guardrails that we use for what we want to have done on a routine basis and how it's being done. And I want you to think about repetitive routine tasks. And sure, we can make an SOP for that, but you might want to think about whether this can be automated. And this may not seem like an employment related question, but it can be because it could be mind numbing work that really should be handled automatically, by a automatic confirmation email, text, or telephone call, online booking, all of these things that now have become so automated and user friendly can free your employees up to really concentrate more on the care of the patient and the client coming through the door. So the SOPs then also can help define your expectations more clearly. How do you want it done specifically? Because what happens is when you have employees training each other, you have no SOPs in place. The old employee is training the new employee. What happens a lot of times is they're doing it the way they like versus the way maybe you would prefer to have it done. And if it's standardized, then the expectations are a little bit more evident, and that's part of the cross training. And in addition, for cross training, if you have several employees that are capable of picking up the SOP and carrying on the procedure, then if you have somebody that's out due to sickness or whatever, or going on maternity leave, you can get that coverage much better. And the other thing too is when employees are operating at 100%, obviously it creates a better client experience. So, ultimately that's our goal, but also we do want to create a good employment environment, and we want to retain our good employees, and we want to make sure that we're doing this properly. And Warren's going to have a ton of information on the nuts and bolts of, what are those things that you need to have in place to make sure that you're covered and that everybody is, understanding exactly what the policies are. The standard operating procedures, the SOPs, also need buy-in. So you need to make sure that the entire organization is aware of them, willing to work with them, and that they have been set up, tested, and given feedback so that, once an employee that would be doing this type of job has the ability to go through the SOP, test it, can give feedback to say, hey, I think we need to add this other step, or, maybe take that out, or, that's no longer needed, and they should be evaluated on an ongoing basis. Maybe annually, go back and say, is there anything that we should be changing in our SOPs? So it creates clarity, fairness, and efficiency for the employees and also for the organization as a whole. And the next thing is you want to align your KPIs and the SOPs with your reviews. And Warren's going to talk about, when you're onboarding a new employee, what is the, type of review process that you want. But also, if you have existing employees, I'm saying that at a minimum, you need to at least meet with your employees once a year for a performance review. I think Warren and I were talking initially, and he suggested it really needs to be much more frequent. And one of the things, two examples that I've seen is I had a small animal practice that, in order to spread things out, they actually reviewed their employees in their anniversary month. So that kind of spread it out over the 12-month period. It was always top of mind that these reviews were going to be done, and it was systemized. In my practice, when we started having formal evaluations with our employees. We did that annually and it was tied to compensation. But what we did is throughout the rest of the year, quarterly, we would have an open door review. Now we only had, under 10 employees. So really it wasn't very time consuming to provide that, but it really was enlightening, receiving the feedback from the employees, what was working, what was not, maybe, how things were going for them. Is there anything that we could implement differently? So having that communication is really key, because if employees are doing their job and they're not sure how well they're doing or whether your expectations are being met, then you have a problem. And the SOPs help you to benchmark that, because the doctors that are working with the employees, it may not just be the sole proprietor, or you might have a multi-doctor practice, and as they're working with these employees, they can evaluate as to whether, are they working with the SOPs? Are they exceeding expectations? Are they not following through? And combined with the metrics associated with that, you can give meaningful feedback and sometimes coaching. You want to save a good employee, you want to help catch these before they become a problem. And it reduces the risk that you may be treating one employee one way, another. And I'll be honest with you, I started my practice 30 years ago and I did not hire employees right away, but when I did, I flew for a couple of years without an employee manual. And then I realized that I couldn't remember exactly what I was doing with one person versus another from year to year. So the employee manual really helps the owners as well as the employees. And I have an example here of, if if you have, for instance, an SOP that is a procedure for how a client is checked in, and then you have a KPI available through the practice management software as to what the wait time is, then that's a review, possibility of a performance review item, as to how that metric is being taken care of and how the actual procedure is being done. So overall, using your KPIs and SOPs in addition to the great policies that Warren is going to be talking about, it keeps staff expectations where they need to be. You have objective feedback versus just subjective, because sometimes that's really difficult to say. I know we're talking an annual review, or whether it's more frequently. Okay, what happened over this time frame? Has it been documented? And how can we give meaningful feedback that's going to help the employee potentially make goals for the next year? Or you might say remedially that they need to start doing X, Y, and Z, but you need to have good examples for that. And that's what we talk about with the consistency and documentation. And documentation can be not only that you're giving the employee feedback, but what if you have a substandard employee and you're in a situation where you're you're probably going to have to fire them. Um, if you don't have appropriate documentation, you could run into problems legally, and Warren's going to talk about that. But one of the things I've seen is, unemployment compensation. You fire the employee and they go file for unemployment. You may say, "Oh, what the heck?" But then it affects your employment rate. You start paying more on your unemployment compensation taxes in the next year, and it can really mount up. So, if that is well documented, you have the ability to say, "No, this was a separation with cause." So basically, that is the feedback that I'd like to give for the operating procedures and the KPIs, and using them in conjunction with the employees and keeping them well, well documented, well communicated with. And then, as I said, Warren's going to get into the actual policies and procedures. The upcoming events that I had, I actually ended up putting them all on the slide, but I wanted to just highlight some of the ones that are specifically for employment, since this is an employment webinar. Justin Weaver is going to come back again and talk about employment contracts, whether non-competes are actually in use at all, if not, and other types of contracts as well. We're also going to be having Trevor DeVries with AVMA PLIT, who's going to be talking about all types of insurances. It could be health insurance, it could be other types of insurance as well, but it maybe cover some of the benefits, maybe a cafeteria plan and things like that that you might have with your employees. Um, then in November, we will have a representative from ADP come out, which is a payroll processor. And there's lots out there. There's, QuickBooks Online, Paychecks, Gusto, lots of different types of payroll processors. And she would just talk about basically what is involved in turning that function over to an outside processor. And if you have interest in any of these webinars, we do have a live link on the slides. It'll take you right to our registration form on the website. And in addition, I did want to just reach out and say that Jonathan Mola from Castle Hill Capital will be my go-to person for retirement and investment planning. And again, this is another area that you really want to look at with your employees and for yourselves, to make sure that you have a retirement vehicle in place. And you can start with something very simple, like a simple plan, or go a little bit more complex with 401ks. And we'll talk about that at another time, but you really want to make sure that you have those pieces in place to help your employees save for retirement. But then there's also vesting opportunities in different types of plans that will encourage people to stay and retain good employees. So you want to make sure you have that. And then obviously we need to have all of our owners and practice managers and so forth, socking away for retirement so that when you get to that point, you can retire with good finances. So after today, if you'd like, you can book a complimentary telephone call with me just to discuss your practice. And I have the link on the next page. You can get a free white paper download, which is an abridged version of my book on my website. And then I hope this webinar helps you build good systems that your team definitely deserves. And I'd like to say thank you very much for coming and attending. I will be at the AVMA conference in Washington, D.C. at booth 1102. So hopefully I'll see you there. And also AAEP in Denver in December. So either of those places, you can track me down. I also wanted to highlight the book that I authored, The Vet Advisor. Are you running your business or is it running you? And we certainly don't want your practice running you into the ground. So that's the objective. But if you're interested in this book, there is a link with the slides that'll take you right to Amazon where that's at. I have my email contact, and I also have the 15-minute complimentary call link here where we can, have a brief conversation, talk about your practice, and see if we want to go further or if I can help you with a question or two. So that's the extent of my talk for this evening, and I'd like to turn it over to Warren. I'm going to stop sharing, and Warren can give you a good introduction to his bio, and he's going to bring up his slides, and we're going to go from there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Holly. Appreciate it. So I won't spend too much time on bio, but so this is all about risk management of your employment practices, as Holly really did a nice job of accentuating. Every practice generally has a workforce, and that workforce can create either a tremendous asset for your practice, or they can create tremendous risk and liability. And how you choose to manage that workforce is really critical. I work almost exclusively with small business owners around the country, actually globally too, but around the country. I've dedicated my career after 15 years in pharma and big Fortune 50 companies to help small business owners really protect their business and things they're growing on. So I'm an IO psychologist. I've got some education and degrees and a bunch of 30 years of experience, but all that to say, what I want to share with you today is really practical strategies and application on these topics as we go through them. So when you think of risk management, and Holly really alluded to this, every business generally by default will have certain insurance in place. They're going to protect their property, they're going to protect their business, they're going to protect their liabilities, they're going to have all kinds of different insurance. But one of the things that can often easily be neglected, both from a practical actual insurance policy, but also just practices, is protecting your business against the employment risks. And they can be significant. I've worked with a few clients this year where one wage lawsuit put them out of business, and they'd been in business about 25 years and had to lay off 16 people. So it's really about protecting your business and understanding your risks. When I engage and work with clients and I'm advising business owners, it's really about here's what is available, what are you trying to accomplish, and then thinking about what's the best way to accomplish that, and making sure that you have information to make risk judgment. You can always do whatever you like. You just should always know what level of risk you're facing if you take that approach or if you do something in that manner. And there's certainly things you don't want to do at all. When I think about HR, it's really about having tying into your systems, people, and processes, right? Do you have the right policies, procedures, and practices in place to minimize risk and minimize liability of the business? And one other thing I'll mention at this point here is when you think about insurance and practices, if you're not familiar with EPLI, which is Employment Practices Liability Insurance, ask your broker about it. Years ago, it used to just be this small little $25,000 rider was thrown into like every general liability policy. And in recent years, they've realized it's about $250,000 to $300,000 to defend an employment claim. So those policies are now on their own. You're going to have a nice big law firm gets involved if you have a claim, and usually you can have pretty low premiums as well as pretty low out of pocket. But if you don't have that in place to protect yourself against a race claim, a discrimination claim, a wage claim, you're missing the boat in protecting your practice. So we're going to cover every one of these pieces of the employee life cycle from planning all the way to exit throughout this kind of talk. But I'm going to start with just a high level manager in the law. These are federal and state regulations that may or may not touch your practice. It really depends in some circumstances about the size of the practice, and I don't mean dollar revenue, just employee size. And then there's some state regulations that apply to any size business. So things to consider: the Fair Labor Standards Act, Family Medical Leave Act, any kind of non-discrimination laws, EEO. Certain organizations will have OSHA obligations and responsibilities, even if they're not required to do OSHA reporting. USERRA has to do with people that are engaged in the military and might be called active duty. You have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and usually it's the Americans with Disability Act, AA, as amended in 1964. And then you've got workers' comp, unemployment, which was alluded to by Holly earlier. And a lot of people don't understand all the complexities around workers' comp. There's actually three types of claims. Unemployment insurance, that topic was also brought up, and it is really critical. Your documentation and corrective action, and we're going to touch on this, defines whether it was performance or conduct based. Anybody who's terminated for performance is going to be eligible for unemployment. But if you can show that there was a willful violation or willful policy violation or willful conduct, generally you can fight that claim to protect, potential enhancements to your insurance rate. But small practices rarely, without a lot of turnover, aren't going to have much rate mobility. They're just going to have to defend the ones they want. And then you've got polygraph and other state regulations that can pop in. When you think about your practice, you've done some of these things already, but when I work with organizations, I try to cover all these items to make sure they understand what they should be doing as a business. And sometimes they find out these things too late. And some of the upcoming webinars that Holly talked about are going to address various topics in these areas that will really give you a well-rounded view of kind of how you should be looking to enhance whatever you're doing today to protect it more. But you're registering your business, you have your withholding accounts, you have your insurance accounts, you have your liability coverages. But the employee handbook is something that a lot of people miss. And it's really about making sure that you're providing notices and other things and policies to your employees. But the bottom two bullets are what I really want to highlight. Your employees generally assume that the owner or the business is doing everything right. And so that's generally not a good assumption. We all know what it means to assume, right? You shouldn't do it. But they assume you are doing things right. So when they find out you're not, it can be really drastically critical because you yourself don't know what you don't know. And if you're not exploring or getting the right guidance or advisor or partner to help you understand these things, they think you're doing it right. You also may think you're doing it right. And suddenly you've got some risk you were unaware of. The last bullet is also about what you shouldn't need to do. So as an example, a lot of organizations I've worked with that are under 50 employees, 20, 30, 40, they'll call me and talk to me about their FMLA claim they just worked on. And I ask them, why in the world are you doing an FMLA claim when you're not required to provide FMLA? And they're like, oh, well, the employee came in, they downloaded some forms off the internet, and I figured I just have to approve it, right? No. So you could set up precedents, you could set up policies and practices, you can set up bad behaviors and practices that you don't even have any liability to do that now you might be on the hook for because you set precedents. So there's things really about knowing what you should and shouldn't do. One of the top categories of risk for businesses pre-COVID, because the IRS and DOL were really going after this, was misclassification. And I can't tell you how many times people say, oh, I've got a whole bunch of 1099 employees, and I just cringe because the word employee does not belong in the same sentence as 1099. Someone is either a W-2 employee or they are an independent contractor. And the significance here, and you'll notice I'm not going to read the slides to you, you're all intelligent, and you're going to get it afterwards, the slides. But the real key here is that the employer is the one with the responsibility of classifying the individual correctly. And it is the employer who is legally responsible if they screw up. So if you classify someone as an independent contractor and they weren't, you're going to be liable for taxes, back wages, benefits, a whole slew of things, plus your name in the paper or online and bad publicity. So you don't let the employee or the individual tell you whether they want to be a 1099 or W-2. You need to determine that based on a number of factors. And there's factors under the DOL, often referred to as the economics realities test, and then under the IRS, because the IRS wants to get their money, as a CPA will tell you. So they want to get their money, so they're really involved because they want to make sure if you're supposed to be withholding taxes and paying them, that you're doing that. So there's different litmus tests and criteria. If you're not familiar with how to determine whether you should have a contractor or an employee, you should get some expert guidance and advice on doing that correctly, because it starts with documenting the job and the roles and the relationship. One other thing I'll mention, anytime you're working with an independent contractor, you should have an independent contractor agreement that outlines the scope of work and the payment and the fees. You also should have a certificate of insurance from them, and you should also make sure you have a W-9, if nothing else. But that's where you start realizing that someone's not a contractor when they go, well, I don't have a liability coverage. I'm not an entity. I don't know what you're talking about. They're probably employee worthy. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, this is the laws that govern wage as far as minimum wage and overtime. You want to make sure that you recognize that the concept of, hey, hourly and salary determines overtime, recognize that's wrong. That's absolutely incorrect. And it's probably one of the top areas that business owners I work with recognize that they didn't understand. And it's okay you don't understand it because you don't have to be the expert on this. You're an expert in the field you're in, right? However, hourly and salary is just a method of payroll. It's how you like paying them, but it's not how they've been classified under the law. And so there's a three-pronged test that you have to go through, which has to do with whether or not they're paid on a continuous salary basis, whether they're paid the same amount every pay period, regardless of hours worked or quality of work, and if they pass the duties test, both the long and short test that's available. So a lot that goes into determining whether or not someone qualifies to be exempt from overtime, that minimum wage and overtime requirements. And if you need help doing this, really, again, reach out. There's a job analysis process that should lead into your job descriptions that help you determine which positions you should or should not exempt in your workplace. And then there's record keeping requirements. From an employment practices risk, as each category you go through, you're going to have a slide that kind of shares with you what the risks are of that category. So you can misclassify, your pay practices may be all messed up. If you misclassified, you might have missed overtime compensation, and there's huge penalties for that. It might impact your insurance coverage. So if you classify someone wrong or you're not paying them right, it might impact their short-term disability benefits or their workers' comp benefits or other things that you're covering them for. Or if you're overpaying them, you might be contributing too much match to a 401k, for example. If you don't have compliant job descriptions or comp programs, those are risks for lawsuits. And then if you're not identifying all the laws related to pay practices, you can run into trouble for sure. And a lot of states have very strict pay and wage practices that exceed federal law. From an employee handbook perspective, to me, a handbook is not a document you issue, you throw on the shelf, and it's done. I try to develop one that represents the culture of the organization. I try to make sure that a handbook is customized in a way that not only are you telling an employee what you expect from them, but they know what they can expect from you if they have a problem with their pay, if they have a problem with their benefits, if they see a policy violation, if they need help communicating a challenge. You're really helping them understand. So two-way communication, it's a living document that says, hey, here's what we're doing for you and here's what you're doing for me, while you're also outlining and listing the regulations, the laws, the notices that are required to provide to an employee. As Holly did point out, if you don't have documentation, any attorney or HR professional will tell you that it's going to be very hard to defend your employment decisions and your personal activity if you don't document. You need to make sure that any decision you make in your workforce can be defensible without you being in the room explaining why you did it, which means documentation. So those policies and practices really help you. And there is a major difference between a policy and an SOP. So the policy sets the rules and requirements, and the SOP, as Holly mentioned, is the procedure in executing the work. how you just execute it versus what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do from a policy perspective or a rule perspective. I always throw this up there, and when I have my interactive webinars, I always ask this question: what stage of the hiring process that I show here, from posting it to interviewing to onboarding, is a risk for your business? And then I get a big chuckle because they go, oh, wait, is it all of them? Yes, it's all of them. So every area of the talent acquisition can pose risk to your business and organization. Hiring becomes one of the most critical processes because you're dealing with people outside of your business who you have no control over. People leaders or people that participate in the interview process are rarely formally trained in the strategies, do's and don'ts, and legalities of the interview process. So you may have great knowledge of it. You may have a great approach to hiring, but if someone in that interview panel says the wrong thing or writes down the wrong thing, you can get sued, and it can be very dramatic of the type of lawsuit for failure to hire or a discrimination claim. I've literally interviewed somebody about 2 years ago who, during the interview process, said, I don't care about answering any questions. I merely interview with companies and then sue them during the hiring process for not hiring me. And they make a living of like $40,000 to $80,000 a month and making NDA protected closed settlements with companies by scaring them. So if you don't have good practices and policies, people are out there trying to, get to litigation, trying to sue, scaring companies. So big problem in not having a well-documented, thought out process with well-trained staff conducting it. Bad hires. The cost, the last estimate I looked at in the data was about 33 to 35% of the annual salary of that role is the cost of making a bad hire and having to go through loss retention. And it doesn't mean, well, it doesn't cost that much to post a job. You can post it free on Indeed. It's about the lost productivity, the bad morale, the employee relations issues, the time spent interviewing, the lost impact on possibly clients and everything else. So bad hires are a problem. You're better off having really good talent acquisition process developed and executed on the front end. Orientation, onboarding. Orientation, you should think of it as what you do with every employee, and onboarding is what you do job specific. So orientation is, your HR training, your handbook, your policies, your procedures, your systems, and all that. But then there should be some additional training, so you're not throwing the person in the fire to set them up for success, related to their specific role. As Holly mentioned, cross training, making sure you have SOPs for all your policies and practices. An employee who knows what's expected of them and knows what they have to do is much more productive and successful than an employee who is like trying to wing it and trying to figure it out because you sit them next to someone else at a front desk and say, just learn from them. And if that person has bad practices, it's going to just permeate through and transition. And then you really want to design all of your, from talent acquisition to the offer stages, pre-employment checks, all that, to onboarding. You want to really have it documented so you can repeat it and make it scalable as you hire and grow. Offer letters versus employment contracts. I know you're going to have some speaker in the future talking about contracts, but you have a question, Holly? Saw your hand raised. Oh, okay. I was like, oh, question. So offer letter is considered in all case law in every state in the United States as legally binding, and it's really designed to support at-will employment approach. It's very rare. Now, in practices with providers, you will often have contracts with a provider, but most of your workforce is going to be at-will employment and not a contract and just an offer letter. Because once you have a contract, it has breach of contract terms. It has terms and conditions of the duration, the timeline, how much has to be paid out. And it's really hard to exit that person without breaking the contract and having to do all those payouts. And it's also hard to really hold them accountable if things change in the practice later on when it wasn't part of the contract. So if you truly have just a workforce of W-2 employees who are service and medical assistants and technicians, none of those people should be on an employment contract. It should simply be an offer letter. And if you misapply these concepts, it can create risk for you later, not understanding what those terms really mean from an at-will perspective versus a contractual perspective. You got to avoid discrimination through the interview process. If you don't have compliant documentation, that's risk. Misrepresentation of the job, the role, the information can be problems. If you don't adhere to various laws and regulations in your state, you could have problems with the hiring process, with the posting process. Some states now require compensation in the posting, some require dates in postings. And the I-9 is often something so easily missed that most payroll systems now will help you in onboarding do it right. One thing I'll highlight, during COVID, you were allowed to do the I-9 process virtually, video, virtually. After 2021 and 2022, the Department of Homeland Security went back to it must be in physical touching that I-9 in person. So you can't do it virtually and you can't just have somebody email you. So be aware of that. And you don't want to have any processes that you can't later defend what you were doing. Leave management. This is a huge one, especially in states that start implementing mandatory paid sick leave or rules around how much time is available. If they implemented some type of family leave, family act, a lot of states are doing that now. Pennsylvania doesn't have paid sick leave in general, but they do in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. So you need to be aware of those, especially if you have employees that go into those cities. There's actually also tax implications of if someone even works in Philadelphia, you've got to have a form that you fill out their time. But leave policies and consistent practices help you manage your workforce. It also is a way to attract and retain talent, having good leave processes. Making sure you know when you have to comply with ADA. If you have 5 people, you might not be required to do an ADA process. If you have less than 50, you don't have to do FMLA. So be aware of what you do and don't have to provide, and also know how those policies can help you attract and retain talent by giving them a good life-work balance. Workplace injury and illness. If you're not familiar with the 3 types of workers' comp claims, there's a report only, a medical only, and a lost wages. A lot of people think that they shouldn't report the bang their knee or hurt their elbow or cut their finger because it's no big deal. But if that later they lose their hand, or if that injury becomes a blood clot, or they lose vision, I mean, you always want to report everything. It is highly unlikely your workers' comp rates change by 1 or 2 claims, and they don't change at all by a report only. You're there to protect the employee and you're there to protect your practice, because you certainly don't want a claim denied and then they sue you because you didn't file the claim. The last thing I'll share on this slide is you do want to have a return to work program. Anytime someone's out of the office, my best practice recommendation is 3 or more days unscheduled, unplanned. You want to have them provide proof that they're ready to come back to work. The reason you do this is you certainly don't want someone to come back to work injured and then turn it into a workers' comp claim on your dime, when the reality is it happened outside of work. So build those policies and practices. If you're not familiar with those programs, I definitely encourage you to explore getting guidance on that. Not having good practices around leave means you could violate the law. You could violate your employees' rights to time off or leave. If you're not consistent with how you approve time, that could be viewed as a claim of discrimination. If you're not filing the workers' comp claims, that could be viewed as discriminatory or not following the law. And really, eligibility impact is based on your other practices. So if you don't properly classify your employees, if you don't track time, you might have a benefit in place that requires them to work 30 or more hours a week, and suddenly they're not, because they're out of the office or they're on some leave and suddenly they're not eligible. So all this kind of really ties together of how you're managing the workforce. Holly mentioned performance management. I completely do disagree with the once a year. If you ever have been told by a supervisor or manager, yeah, I'm not giving you a bonus this year because remember back in March, you didn't do this right. And you're sitting there going, well, you didn't tell me, you didn't give me a chance to improve. I had no idea I could correct my behavior. So frequency is key, but from a compliance and risk management, you'll have the best performing employees if they know what's expected of them. You set good goals collaboratively. They have those SOPs to reference. You're setting goal expectations, and you're providing regular feedback, both great job, Sally. Hey, Sally, I need you to improve here. Positive and negative, so it's not like they're going to the principal's office every time you talk to them. That's an approach that creates a very successful performance management program. And it's really about professional development. Having these employees you hire and spent time and resources to bring on board, managing them. And then corrective action is critical. If you're not timely in corrective action, it's worthless. It's kind of like yelling at a dog 5 minutes later after they've already done something wrong. So corrective action should be timely, and your documentation is key to defend the decision. So if you go down the path of issuing formal corrective action, reprimands, suspensions, time off, or if you terminate the employee, if you don't have documentation that speaks for itself of why, even though it's at will employment, someone's going to try to sue you for discrimination or wrongful termination. And I will jump in here and say one more thing about at will employment. There's a misnomer that at will employment means I can hire and fire anyone for any reason. That's not a factual statement. You can hire or fire for any legal reason. So if you fire someone because you're discriminated against them and they figure that out or think that, you have exposure. So it's much better to make sure all your personnel decisions are documented as to why, and you'll be much safer for it. If you're not consistent with your communication and performance, it could be a problem. If you don't hold people accountable timely, it could be a problem for your practice, especially employee morale issues. I can't tell you how many times when employees come to complain and they quit saying, well, Jane Doe's not doing her job, and so I'm doing the job, and you never hold them accountable, so I don't want to work here. Right? So it's not good as a leader to not hold staff accountable because your good performers will walk out the door when that happens. If you don't have a handbook or policies to execute performance management or at least hold them accountable against something, that can also be risky. And training. Always train your people on your policies and procedures before you hold them accountable for it, because otherwise their response will be, I didn't know. And it's hard to kind of go down that path. Benefits, Holly mentioned this as well as attracting and retaining talent. And it seems like there's an upcoming speaker that's going to talk about insurances. But these are just the laundry list of things you can consider when you're a smaller practice. Sometimes these things can be cost prohibitive. Medical, dental, and vision, when you have those plans, you're going to have some kind of program and design plan. It's going to be an employer cost. Small businesses generally end up with age-based rating. So it's going to be much more expensive until you can hit a composite rate. Short and long-term disability, in my opinion, is the first thing I take small businesses to. It's usually the cheapest way to provide your employees the best bang for the buck. If you tell an employee you've got medical and dental and they're young and they don't think they're invincible, they're at the age where, hey, nothing's ever going to happen to me, they're not even going to use the coverage and you're spending a lot of money. But if you tell an employee, hey, if you get hurt, whether it's on the job or not, and you can't work the rest of your life, I'm going to provide you an insurance policy that's going to pay you. Hey, if you're out for 3 months and you can't pay your bills, I'm going to make sure you're paid because I'm going to protect you in case that happens. So I'll always look through working with business owners to look at this laundry list of available options and think about what's best for the workforce and your dollar. Everything for me, for the business owner, is putting as much money away for yourself, making it profitable and saving in those retirement plans. Some states, Pennsylvania doesn't have it now, do require certain types of programs for savings. But when you go down that path of retirement programs, you really want to make sure you're designing something, as Holly mentioned, that's not just good for the employees, but also for you as the owner. How much are you able to put away each year? How much are you able to put tax deferred? Are you going to have a profit share? Are there other ways to stash money that's not going to be taxed that helps you bring more home for the hard work you're doing? And then whether you're using stipends or reimbursements and understanding the tax implications. I have some clients that didn't even realize issuing safety shoes in the workplace was something that was going to be imputed income for the employee. So really having the experts around you that help you navigate that is critical. And let's get to the end of that whole cycle of what the workforce separation. Voluntary and involuntary is really critical. If someone is sitting in a meeting with you as a bad employee and says, you know what, maybe I'll just quit, your next sentence should be, great, I accept your resignation. Because if someone resigns, they're not eligible for unemployment. And also you want to document that if they left, then it's hard to claim that you fired them for any discriminatory reason if you have evidence that they resigned. You want to have a good practice and process for like knowledge transfer. So if you have a good employee who's exiting, make sure you have some kind of program to do transfer of knowledge, maybe manuals, maybe an SOP review, so that you can continue that great work even when that person leaves. Make sure you're documenting the termination process because it is at will. So you want to make sure you document it well and know what your paycheck practices are. This has been changing year after year, different states. Pennsylvania says if you terminate somebody versus a voluntary resignation, you must pay them on or before the next regular pay date. Some states have even more strict. New York and Jersey have more strict than that, and you guys are close to there. Understand where benefits, COBRA, and any kind of property and equipment impact. So if there are benefits in place, make sure you have COBRA programs that are compliant. Make sure you get your property back and your equipment. You can't hold a paycheck just because they didn't give you that laptop back. So know the rules and regulations before you go into everything so you can manage it down the line Having a strategic advisor who can tell you all these things are going to happen to you before they happen is also usually pretty healthy because they've been through the process. And again, if you're not consistent in handling these things, tremendous risk. Unemployment claim exposure if you don't terminate properly, meaning you don't designate as a performance or conduct. You don't want to violate paycheck laws because employees usually find out about them, and there's like a 2-year timeline that they can file. Just like wage claims, 2 years they can go back. And then discrimination. You don't want to have discrimination in how you handle your employees and various benefits and things. These other risks, and you can review this later when the slide deck comes out, but there's a lot of things going on in a workplace that you may or may not be aware of that can create problems. In some states, like my state here, Colorado, non-competes and non-solicitation policies are absolutely illegal. Other states have certain restrictions. So knowing what you can and can't do and knowing what you can and can't have in your handbook is critical. I've actually seen handbooks that the second page of the handbook is where an employee's signing that they'll never sue the company. And one, that's illegal. But two, that would never hold up in court because if someone goes to the Department of Labor or the EEOC to file a lawsuit, the employee's not the one filing the lawsuit against you. It's the enforcement agency. So that document doesn't hold water anyway. So just understanding all these things really becomes critical. And then just to kind of an overview recap is planning the workforce and understanding where the workforce risks are will help you determine how you should train your people, any people leaders training they should get, how you should formalize your process and procedures. They can be your greatest asset, but your workforce can also be your greatest risk. When I talk to solo practitioners and they start talking to me about, I'm going to hire staff, I'm so excited. I say, right now, your greatest worry is how much money you're making. Tomorrow, your greatest worry is losing sleep over what your employees are doing. Documentation is critical to your success, and really make sure you engage some experts to know what laws do and don't impact your specific business. So I blew through that fast, but I know we're on limited time and I want to respect everybody that's here today. But there's my contact information and it'll be in the slide deck that goes out. But I thank you all for your time today. And I will turn it back over to Holly to see if we had any questions come through that I'd be happy to answer. You're on mute.
I'm on mute.
There you go.
There we go. At this time, I don't have any questions, but people are welcome to, that in the Q&A, please feel free to jot things down and send them out, and we can answer. I did have a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
Like on the 1099 contract, a lot of times what vets are going to run into is they're relief vets, that come in and, they have an employment or, excuse me, not employment, but they have a contract with the independent contractor.
Yeah.
They get a W-9 and they issue a 1099. And usually that relief vet is working for other, practices as well. So the behavioral issues are there. What are problems that you could foresee coming through that area?
So I don't think that what you described, and I've seen in many practices all over, that type of scenario isn't the risky part usually, because they're working for multiple practices. They truly are getting income from multiple places. They have their own insurance. They might even be going through an agency or someone coordinating a broker. I don't worry too much about are they classified right providers generally. One of the clinics, my wife runs dermatology clinics, and they have a Mohs practitioner that travels the country and comes in with them, but just a contractor, right? They're not getting benefits. They're not involved in the meetings. They have a different policy and procedures they give them. They don't give them an employee handbook. But the risks when you have someone that comes in regularly from the outside, whether it's a provider or not, is how do you make sure they're aware of your policies and procedures? How do you let them know what they are responsible for doing, even though they're not an employee? And how do you make sure the interaction between them and the rest of the staff, who to them it's just another provider, right? Like are they a contractor employee? Who cares? Like, it's a provider I'm serving. Making sure that the boundaries are well defined, making sure that you have a contractor policy or SOP document where you're not saying employee, 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 where you're saying we want you as a contractor to be aware that you also run risk of discrimination practices and you have to have fair communication and we expect respect in their workplace. So setting those boundaries and rules for them is important. Making sure that you have some clarification that they know they're not covered under your workers' comp policy, making sure they know that they're probably not covered under any of your liability coverages, most likely, right? They're just not. So making sure that clarity is there, and also ensuring that they know providers are generally also, they're not always the people leader. Sometimes you have a practice manager managing the people, but they should still be aware of when they should report something to the practice. If they see discrimination, if they see a patient harassing the front desk, if they see something going on, they should be obligated to report it, because they could be civilly liable, even though they're a contractor, of not reporting something that's a lawful violation. So it's just educating them on things, but not treating them as an employee, but making them aware of things that will allow for consistency in the practice for the workforce.
How do you present that documentation? I mean, we have an employee handbook. Do you actually suggest a contractor handbook or something like that?
I usually do. I mean, even in pharma, we had 20, 30 contractors on any given week in there. They would come through and go through contractor training and a contractor manual that was more driven on our policies and practices that will expose them or impact them. So if they were contracting and had people they were working for or working with under them, they needed to know what to observe, what to report, but it wasn't necessarily that they would execute the process. So, for example, if I have a people leader in the practice that sees two employees doing something, one to another employee wrong, they should initiate something, maybe engage HR or the practice owner, report it, make sure the complaint is identified, engage, investigate. The contractor might just be, please report this to the practice owner, right?
Right.
So it's not the whole process sometimes, but you don't want to lose out something simply because a contractor is there. You don't want to lose your responsibilities as a business owner and as an employer in missing something you should do to protect the business or protect the employee simply because the employment classification. But
Right.
it is kind of tricky sometimes. Same with organizations that have interns. Interns should not be signing employee handbooks because they're not an employee unless they're a
Right.
W-2 intern. So if they're through a
Mhm.
program, I have them sign a waiver of workers' comp. I have them sign a document that says they're a volunteer. I have them sign something that says they know they're not going to get compensated. So it's really knowing the audience, but still trying to achieve consistency in the workplace that everyone feels safe, protected, respected, right, and they're advocated for.
Right. Right. Absolutely. I also had a question about the three-prong test
Yep.
for, is that
Exempt
state or federal for
federal.
overtime and
It's both. So most states also match. So under federal, you have to meet the salary basis, which the federal under the FLSA, the federal law last June was changed. It was going to go up to $58,000. In November, a court in I believe Texas challenged it, and in January it got struck down. So it went back to the $38,000 a year. However, your state may have higher salary thresholds, and the salary threshold isn't the biggest problem; it's the duties test. But Colorado, for example, set theirs at 55,000 this year. So if you don't make at least the salary threshold, you cannot classify them exempt, which means they're eligible for minimum wage and eligible for overtime. And a lot of
right.
people will tell me, practices I work with, they'll say, oh, it's okay. I cut that number in half because they're part-time. And I said, well, you just broke the law. Because when they're exempt, you're saying, I don't care about how much time they work or the quality of work. So if they work 1 hour or 50 hours, they're paid the same amount to get the job done. So you can run into a lot of problems if you don't understand that. The duties test is the EAC, which is, back in the 60s, 70s when this came out. This is what drove the white collar, blue collar mentality. So executive, administrative, professional. Executive is owner, practice owner, authority, hire, fire, decisions about the whole business. Administrative is not your admin. Administrative means maybe your marketing leader, your HR leader, your finance leader, someone who runs a division, a department, a location, hire, fire. Like they are making judgment calls that impact the business as a whole. The professional is where most positions will land, and that's where it requires you have advanced training or education. So if you
Mhm.
have a job analysis and you look at a medical assistant, like in Colorado, they don't even require them to be certified. So if you have a job description that has a requirement that all you need is a high school diploma and 4 years experience, that job will never be exempt
Right.
because you don't require advanced training or skills. But if I have a chemist who has to have a chemistry degree, if I have a veterinarian who has to have a vet license, and this, if I have an MA that requires licensing or a master's degree, that is what allows you to use the duties test to say, under the duties, they pass. Oh, but I'm only paying them 40 grand, so now they don't pass. So you have to look at all three together. And some organizations will say, well, for this type of work, especially in the medical field, this type of work is admin work. I pay them this rate. Over here, though, is clinical work. I pay them this rate, so they're exempt. Well, if you're paying them at any point hourly or different rates, they can't be exempt because it's not a consistent salary every week. So
Right.
FLSA is a tough area. And the third thing that really comes up, which is weird, is there's been in the 90s and 2000s, being told you're hourly, which is the wrong term, it's non-exempt, made people feel like they weren't professional. If I'm
Mhm.
hourly and you pay me $100 an hour, I don't care what my classification is. I'm paid $100 an hour. So some organizations struggle with the overtime and the exempt, non-exempt. I had a credit union that struggled with it. And I said, you close your doors at 5 o'clock. Yeah. Can anyone work overtime? No, they all leave by then. Oh, so why are you worried about overtime? Like, just make them hourly and stop worrying about it, right? So sometimes you have to step back with a business owner and say, what's the goal and purpose here? Are you worried about a financial risk? Well, maybe you're not managing the performance of your employees and they're working more than they should. They're getting
Yeah.
they're working 10 hours a day when they should get the work done in 7. So there's so much that ties into how you should inform that decision. But it's a risky
Yeah.
area.
Yeah, and that's one of the areas too that we need to look at on the vet practices is are the employees running into overtime and is that warranted? Either one, you're going to run into burnout if they are truly productive during that time
Yes.
frame, or maybe there's inefficiencies that are taking place that we need to look at. So absolutely. Question would be real quick would be on the vet techs. Very often in the practices, the vet tech may be have that title, but may not come with the training and the
Credentials.
certificate.
Yeah.
In small animal, mostly the veterinary technicians do have the degree. So, where do they stand in that regard? What is your thought there?
So the Department of Labor, one other thing I'll add though to the classification, just to say, misclassification for wage under FLSA, just be aware that an employee can go back 2 years. So if someone today is having Thanksgiving dinner or Memorial Day dinner with a family member and they bring this up and they go, I don't think that practice last year was paying me right, you're still on the hook. So the sooner you determine whether or not you're doing it right to try and fix it, the better. Um,
Right,
the Department of Labor doesn't care about the title. They care about the actual duties, which is why your job description should be documented that it was based on a job analysis where you
right,
took all
okay,
the duties, responsibilities, and that built the job description. Um, but they don't care about titles because if you think about it, I don't know a small business like a small business, 4 or 5 people, that everyone's not a VP of something. Right. I'm the VP of marketing, I'm VP of that, but their duties might not be. Let's give the admin practice manager title, even though they don't really do much. They're just right. So title's not as important, but you have to have a standard where it should always be the minimum. So if you have a position where you might have some credentialed and you might not, and they're doing the same job, the reality for under the law would be minimally, it looks like someone with the high school diploma and 2 years experience is capable of doing the job. Now, the one with
right,
more experience might be able to do it better, maybe, but that's like someone who's a business owner. If I go to Walmart, I'm getting paid the same rate, whether I have 30 years experience or not, because I'm paid for the job, right? Even if I'm overqualified, which isn't a real term in law. So you want to look at minimum qualifications. And then if a practice has been around a while, you want to revisit your job descriptions every year or two because you can address that problem with, wait a minute, a year ago when we wrote the job description, we had a couple people who only had 2 years experience, but now it's 2 years later. Now we can update our job description to say, in order to do our job properly and effectively, it's 4 years experience. Wait, now
right,
all of our people got certified. Now I'm going to update the job description that says I'm only going to replace this position who with if they have a certification. So you want to
right,
monitor that growth of your workforce to change because the reality is if Mary Jane tomorrow leaves and she's been with you 6 years, when you hired her, she might have only needed 1 year experience. Now she has 6 years experience. When she walks out
right.
the door, you're losing a lot of knowledge. You want to replace them with a similar competency. So you have to review so that when you start the posting process, you're getting the right talent. And a lot of people forget that. And they're like, I don't know why everyone's not as good as Mary Jane because we're trying to hire a 1 year person and we forgot they need 6 years experience to be as good as she was. So it's
Yeah,
really
yeah, you forget that 6 years of time under
knowledge.
their belt.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
for sure. But it really is looking at that. It's always going back and going our current workforce. And if you have, like, let's say you want the credentials, but you have 2 people in your practice who don't have it, you
yeah,
can't post the job as requiring it, but you can say
right.
preferred. And there's a difference between a job description and a posting. Your posting's your ad, your job description, an internal minimum document.
Right. Right. Well, this has
Fun.
been absolutely wonderful, Warren. I really appreciate it. I don't have any formal questions in the
That's
Q&A.
fine. Yep.
And I don't think that, I jotted down a few notes for myself, but those were
Sure.
the questions that I had. So I
Perfect.
really appreciate your time. And thank you for the folks that attended. We'll be sending out the recording and the slides afterwards. And if there's any questions, please feel free to reach out by email. And I think, Warren, you're saying you were going to reach out and send a thank you to the registrants as well, correct?
Yep, I'll send something out, and just like you have your 15-minute, I do a free 1 hour discovery call because HR takes a lot to get through a discovery call. But if anybody has questions on any of these topics or just wants to just have a conversation of where they think they are currently, I do that. There's no charge for that, just to help them understand where
Sounds
they're at.
great. Really good, really good.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. And I think I'm going to stop the recording and then we can finish up.